Doctor Who The Time Monster, the 14th story of the Third Doctor, is written by Robert Sloman and Barry Letts and starring John Pertwee, Katie Manning, Nicholas Courtney, Richard Franklin and John Levine. The comprehensive production documentation of Season 9 Blu-ray collection said when Sloman was to write the final six-part story for the season in May 1971, the title was called The Daleks in London. By December 1971 the idea had been scrapped, so The Time Monster was written instead. The PAL master tapes had been wiped. NTSC copies were returned to the BBC from TV Ontario in Canada in 1983. In 1987, a low-bound 625-line monochrome tape of episode 6 was discovered at the BBC, and it was recoloured by combining the black and white picture with 525-line colour signal of the episode, creating a superior copy to the NTSC one. The story begins with effective scene where the Doctor had a bad dream about sitting on a chair in the room with volcanic eruption and the Master laughing. So the Doctor woke up as Joe gave him a cup of tea and warned Brigadier, and it's so hilarious how Brigadier reacts. "You'll be consulting an entrails of a sheep next." Brilliant line. Meanwhile, at the laboratory in Newton Institute, the Master calls himself Professor Thas Kalos holds the crystal. The Doctor saw in his dream working with Dr. Ruth Ingram. The Master says crystal is no different than any other piece of quartz, yet it is. Stuart Hyde came in, the Master leaves them to conduct further experiments. After he has left, Ruth says she doesn't know which is more annoying, dictational manner or that infernal courtesy of his. Mike Yates points at the Thera Islands where the quakes have struck. Joe says Atlantis, telling the Doctor that Thera is rapidly its location. Brigadier wanted to see Tom Tit, which stands for Transmission of Matter Through Interstitial Time, demonstration at the Newton Institute. Benton, who was meant to be going off duty, is asked to go instead. Master hypnotizes Dr. Charles Percival into believing him about his Tom Tit experiments and his credentials. Ruth and Stu decided to run the test without the Master. The Doctor used a time sensor to detect the Master. It shows the TARDIS is in use. The jar disappears, which is cool effects for the classic era. The Master notices the clock has slowed down, and I love the soundtrack where the Doctor's driving around in Bessie with Joe. It's so cool that they reuse it in the next story, The Three Doctors, even though I actually watched The Three Doctors long before I watched The Time Monster. As the Brigadier, Benton and Dr. Cook, Proctor, Percival and Ruth came into the control room. Cook complains about his pheasant's lunch and expenditures. The Master enters in a radiation suit to seal his identity. After the test begun, Ruth warns the Master that the power is overloading. Stu is in the crystal room. He gets too much power and can't control it. He calls to them to switch it off. Ruth shouts a warning at the Master, and the Master shouts, "Come, Cronus, come!" which is intense cliffhanger. As a result, Stu is aged into old man by the time. The Doctor and Joe arrive with Bessie. Joe is frozen in time, so the Doctor had to get to the lab, telling Ruth to reverse the polarity and cut the power. While Stu is resting, the Brigadier said the only thing that makes people age naturally is passing of time. So the Doctor realises this is the explanation of Stu's personal time has been vastly accelerated. Everyone realised the Professor is indeed the Master, as Thas Kalos is Greek for Master, just like Magister is Latin for the Master from the demons. So after Stu tells everyone about the Chronos, the Doctor and Ruth went back to the lab. The Brigadier summons troops from UNIT as well as the Doctor's TARDIS. He tells Percival to order the evacuation of the building, essential personnel by 3 o'clock. Ruth shows the Doctor the crystal, and the Doctor says carnivores, time eaters, and chronos.
As it was used 4,000 years ago to capture the chronivore.
So that's what you meant when you talked of terrible danger.
And I thought the Temple of Poseidon long ago with Kronos beginning to stir looked pretty cool. The Doctor discovers that crystal has been moved through intergenerational time. This means it really is the original crystal used to summon Kronos in Atlantis. There's a clever scene where the Master puts on Brigadier's voice and phones Sergeant Benton, tricking him to leave the lab, so he walks out. However, he climbs back through the window and confronted the Master and Percival as he didn't fall for it, as Brigadier would never call sergeants my dear fellow. So after Benton gets knocked out, a priest called Krasus materializes. It looks pretty cool. So the Master tells Krasus to give him the secret of controlling Kronos. Benton managed to slip away and warns the Doctor about the Master. So then Kronos appears and aids Percival. He looks so effective. As Brigadier Benson and Ruth ran towards the lab, they ended up in slow motion, so the Doctor had to pull them out of the time field. Stu's aging has reversed and he's young again. Hooray! The Master returns Kronos to Crystal, which Krasis claims is but a portion of the original. In Atlantis, Hippias asks Lord Dalios if the time has come for Kronos to return at last. Dalios is old enough to remember the time of Kronos and fears his return. He shows Hippias the true crystal. At Hyde's apartment, we get a amusing scene. As tea and toast are getting made, Brigadier is like, first we're talking about universe blowing up and now we're talking about tea. Also when time flow analog, which works like jamming a radio signal. It lasted until the Master uses Tom Titt's device to overload it. There's awesome cliffhanger where people from different times appear at the field attacking Mike Yates and unit troopers as they're taking the TARDIS. There's medieval knights, a troop of roundheads, and while Sergeant Benton with Ruth and Stu in the apartment, the Doctor, Joe and Brigadier drove round in Bessie at the field. There was a German V-1 flying bomb. As it bombs where the unit soldiers are, we thought Mike Yates is killed off, but obviously not.
It's a bomb! Die! Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Over! Mike, can you hear me?
John Pertwee is awesome as the Third Doctor. As always, I love Katie Manning as Jo Grant. Her chemistry with John are one of the best things of the era. Nicholas Courtney, John Levine and Richard Franklin are amazing as Brigadier Lethbridge Stewart, Sergeant Benton and Captain Mike Yates. I always love their humour, they always have brilliant lines. You definitely can't go wrong with Roger Delgado as the Master.
Believe you, I am the Master. You will listen to me?
Wanda Moore and Ian Collier plays Dr. Ruth Ingram and Stuart Hyde, scientists, assisted by the Master under the name of Professor Carl Thas-Kalos, creating Tom Titt. I like those guys, they're brilliant. Ian later played Omega in Arc of Infinity, also does Big Finish audio series. John Weiss plays Dr. Charles Percival, the director of the Newton Institute, he's great too. Neville Barber plays Dr. Humphrey Cook, chairman of the Grants Committee, who's there to investigate Tom Titt, he's canny. Neville later played Howard Baker in Canaan and Company. Terry Walsh plays the window cleaner, which is cool. Kronos, the name has two spellings, is the most fearsome of the carnivores, a species of extra-dimensional creatures that devour time. He and his siblings were worshipped as titans by ancient Greeks and by the people of Atlantis, which he eventually destroyed. And I thought he was pretty fascinating. He's played by two different actors, Mark Boyle and Ingrid Bauer. David Prowse plays Minotaur, half man, half bull, the subject of several myths recorded in Greek mythology, which I thought is interesting. And of course David is more known for physically playing Darth Vader in the Star Wars original trilogy. George Cormack plays King Dalius of Atlantis, he's brilliant. George later played Kampar in Planet of the Spiders. Seeing this story I was like, wait a minute, I recognise that voice from somewhere. As I've already seen Planet of the Spiders long before I watched The Time Monster. Ingrid Pitt plays Queen Gallia of Atlantis, Dalios' wife. She's great too, and later played Solo in Warriors of the Deep. Donald Eccles plays Krasis, the High Priest of Poseidon in Atlantis at 1500 BC, who serves Kronos. He does a great job. Donald was also considered for the role as Barusa in The Deadly Assassin before he went to Angus McKay. Aidan Murphy plays Hippias, who's part of King Dalios' Council. He's a cool character. Susan Penhaligon plays Lackey's, a handmaiden to Queen Jalio. I like her. Susan later played Shayla in Primeval audio series. The casts are brilliant. You can tell that they had fun with their roles that they're given. The sets are amazing, so is the direction by Paul Bernard, and it's well written, and I love the music by Dudley Simpson, as I've said many times before. So after the bombing, Mike Yates and the soldiers survived, thankfully, but they're injured, so Mike has to go to the hospital. Ruth wanted to go to the lab, Benton and Stu disagreed, but they did, to stop the Master. So the Doctor and Joe walks inside the TARDIS.
Doctor?
Yeah?
TARDIS looks different.
Oh, this is but a redecoration, that's all.
With a redesigned interior where the round things look like salad bowls. Barry Letts wasn't keen on that design, and apparently the set was damaged shortly after the filming of the story was finished, and as a result, it was discarded. Meanwhile, outside the lab, Brigadier and the unit are frozen in time, then a TARDIS disappeared away. Then the Master disappeared away in his TARDIS with Krasis and landed inside the Doctor's TARDIS. The Doctor explains that if the frequency of the two TARDISes is too high, even by a fraction, a time realm will occur, resulting in utter annihilation. They end up stuck in a space loop. With the Master's TARDIS, they enter one, they come out into the other. The Master taunts the Doctor, pointing out that he could easily throw his enemy into the time vortex and refusing to listen to the Doctor.
I'm sorry about your coccyx too, Miss Grant. How very sociable of you both to drop in.
When the Doctor forces the sound of his voice through to the Master's TARDIS, the Master made the Doctor speaking backwards, which is so bizarre. As Benton, Ruth and Stu are stuck in the lab, they try turning off the machine. It has no effect on the Brigadier and the unit soldiers, but Benton has turned into a baby, which is cool. As the Doctor steps inside the Master's TARDIS, the Master refuses to listen, to reason again, and brought in Kronos, attacking the Doctor, then disappeared and breaks the lock on the Doctor's TARDIS, sending it with Jo into the vortex. So Jo hears the Doctor's voice and tells her to pull the lever from the console. So she did, and voila! The Doctor materialized inside the TARDIS from the vortex. Meanwhile, in Atlantis, Dalios holds court. Hippias talks to the king about the people wishing for their blessings their ancestors enjoyed under Kronos. Dalios tries telling his people that Kronos was a curse, so the Master arrives trying to convince people to trust him by bringing Krasis back. So Dalios takes the Master and Krasis with him to talk about the site of Kronos. After the Master failed to hypnotize Dalios, the Doctor and Jo arrives, and we get a funny and awkward scene where they saw the Master and he was like, "Good afternoon, now where have I seen you before?" And the way Jo was introduced, Jo Grant, and everyone calls her Jo Grant. I bet everyone calls James Bond after introducing himself Bond James Bond. "Hello, Bond James Bond, how you doing, mate?" After meeting the king, Jo is brought to Gallia. The king asks for the Doctor's help to save Atlantis. Gallia and the Master meet to discuss the crystal. Jo and lackeys were spying on the conversations, so they tried to warn the Doctor, but the guards wouldn't let them in, as they didn't want to disturb the king. The crystal is in a maze guarded by the Minotaur. Gallia sends Hippias to retrieve the crystal. Krasis spotted Jo, puts her in the maze with a scary sound of roar, which reveals to be Minotaur. And I thought the scene looks pretty cool and scary. Ugh. So the Doctor goes in, and Jo is saved by Hippias, but he's sadly thrown away by the Minotaur. After the Doctor plays the bull game with the Minotaur and got thrown down to the pit, Doctor and Jo find the crystal of Kronos waiting inside the secret room, but caught by Krasis, who takes the crystal. The Doctor wanted to see the king, but it turns out to be the Master, who took over with Gallia's help. The Doctor and Jo are locked up, and we get an interesting conversation about his hermit friend and a daisy. So Dalios walks in and dies, which is a sad scene. As the council are summoned at Atlantis, Plaza surviving prisoners are fastened either side of their days. The Doctor and Jo told everyone what the Master did. Kronos attacks, then disappeared.
Stop it! Kronos! I, the Master, welcome you! I, the Master, bid you do my...
After the Master took Jo away in his TARDIS and disappeared away, the Doctor went after him. They arrived in nothingness. At first the Doctor and Jo thought they're dead and they're in heaven. A large woman face appears on the ground who reveals to be Kronos, and she's free and thanking the Doctor's help and plans to keep the Master to torment him. The Doctor asks to take the Master with him so he can deal with him in his own way. However, the Master makes a run for it in his TARDIS and escapes. At the lab, Stu is feeding baby Benton while Ruth works on the machine. It exploded. Brigadier and the unit soldiers are unfrozen. They walked inside the lab. The Doctor and Jo arrived. Brigadier was confused where the Master is and what Jo was wearing, which, by the way, it's a really nice looking outfit. And it's so hilarious where Benton is back to his age and completely naked, and everyone laughs, and Brigadier seems to disapprove, just being like... A brilliant story. It's a nice ending for Season 9. That's that wrapped up now. What did you think of The Time Monster and Season 9? Let me know in the comments down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.